we're treating one fragmented business model with another fragmented business model that doesn't really get to the fundamental requirements of supporting defense capabilities throughout their life cycle.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's August 27th, 2025.
At the core of our new strategic approach to defense and security, we will also establish Borealis, the Bureau of Research, Engineering, and Advanced Leadership in Innovation and Science. Borealis will advance cutting-edge research in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other frontier technologies essential to safeguarding Canadian sovereignty. Because today, defense is not only about manpower.
In recent months, the federal government has taken several steps to address the challenges inherent in Canada's management of defense procurement. As global security challenges continue growing and demands on the Canadian Armed Forces increase, pressure is mounting for the federal government to fix how it buys and maintains military equipment. The Liberal Party proposed creating a standalone defense procurement agency, reviving an idea first floated in 2019, as a way to streamline the process and improve accountability. The move is reflective of a broader debate over whether restructuring the machinery of government could finally solve the country's chronic procurement problems. With me today to discuss the merits of and challenges of implementing a defense procurement agency, I'm joined by Troy Crosby, former Assistant Deputy Minister for Ministerial and National Armaments Director, Phil Lagassé, Barton Chair at NIPSIA, and Chuck Davies, CDAI Fellow. This is the Expert Series. Troy, thanks so much for joining the Expert Series podcast today. So I'm wondering if, to set us up, you can discuss the broad impetus for a defense procurement agency, what impact it might have on procurement, and maybe within that you can touch on what the current system looks like.
Sure, happy to do that. I think first and foremost for me, the question is how will changes improve Canadian Armed Forces readiness in a cost-effective way where we're going to see improved timeliness and predictability in the procurement processes. Of course, the government very much has its mind on the economy in the future and our sovereignty, and I think it'll be important too to consider how we may see improvements to outcomes from an economic, there's discussion as well about a defense industrial strategy. How does that all tie together? I don't know whether or not most people are aware of the scope of what the Ministerial group particularly is responsible for at National Defense. When we think Defense Procurement Agency, there's probably an immediate thought to the large major capital projects that tend to make the news, and some of the smaller ones as well, of course. But the Ministerial group and defense procurement is much broader than that. Procurement includes in-service support contracting, for example, and the Ministerial group, other than the capital projects and that sustainment in-service support lens, also really has its focus on what's referred to as material assurance. And material assurance includes ensuring the safety, fitness for purpose, availability, and compliance of the equipment that is procured and in service with the Canadian Armed Forces. And there's also an element of what I might refer to as defense diplomacy, where the ADM Ministerial is Canada's National Armaments Director representative at NATO.
Well, thanks for that scene setter, Troy. I know as well that, one of the rationales potentially for having a defense procurement agency is the quote unquote single point of accountability, which some think might improve the system. I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on whether having a single point of accountability hypothetically would improve the system at all, and maybe what's driving that thought process.
I start my thought there actually by referring back to this opportunity as creating a single point of authority. Some people like to talk about accountability. Of course, professionals know that with authority comes accountability. But if you'll frame the question around what a single point of authority would be, then there may be some opportunity for improvement. We all know the system right now is federated. There are a lot of stakeholders there who have input to trying to solve or establish procurement strategies and these sorts of things. There's all sorts of competing policies and objectives that are layered onto these procurements. And it's a lot of the time spent in consensus building or trying to find compromise that eats up time, and may, from some perspectives, result in suboptimal outcomes, which of course is kind of the nature of compromise and consensus building. But ultimately, there needs to be someone who decides. There needs to be a decider. And that single point of authority would be a potential opportunity. There's a practical limit to it. There's always going to be a desire or a need for important government policy decisions to go to cabinet. So no single minister is likely, well, it's possible. Right now, that single point of authority, you could argue, is the prime minister. The question will be, will the prime minister choose to push some of that authority, that decision-making, down to a single minister, or at least a minister who's then responsible for finding the consensus among their peers. Treasury Board will be involved. To what extent is an important question. The more authority for project approvals, expenditure authorities can be pushed down to a single minister, the faster things will move because there'll be less process involved. Of course, there'll be a limit there as well. There's some questions about requirement setting. I think the Canadian Armed Forces, under current legislation, and because they're the ones who ultimately have to make the decisions, the Minister of National Defence will always play a very important role there. But there could be questions about, all right, well, what about the rated requirements? The things you'd like to have but are acknowledging aren't mandatory? How much of that should be in there, and what are the consequences and the trade-off of including those rated requirements or not? And procurement strategies I touched on already. That's all about trade-offs by definition: capability, cost, industrial, technological benefits, economic outcomes, other outcomes. Who's going to make that choice about the weightings and ratings? And importantly, if there are policies under the control of other ministers, and I'm thinking of the ITB policy right now, then if that becomes a constraint or restraint on the DPA's authorities and its maneuver space and what it can do, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, you're accountable, but your hands are somewhat tied by external restrictions that are being put on your option space. So there's a lot at play there, obviously. It'll be very interesting to see how it settles out and what the exclusions might be. What's included is important. We need to pay attention to what ultimately is excluded, because that will erode that single point. And actually, we could find ourselves in a worse case with just a different kind of bureaucracy, I suppose.
So building on that thought, setting the DPA would potentially require the merger of a number of large organizations with different organizational cultures and processes, as you sort of alluded to. I'm wondering if you might be able to, even though we don't know what such an agency would look like yet, I'm wondering if you can reflect on perhaps some of the benefits and challenges inherent in that.
In the current system, the people who are working inside work very closely together. They come from different departments. They may not be sitting together in the same office spaces, but they work closely together. Culturally, though, decision-making, how decisions are made, is driven a lot by leadership style. And of course, the more organizations are involved, therefore, the number of different decision-making processes and considerations change. Bringing it under one point of accountability will help to facilitate that, but that means people who've been doing this work for years and years and years and know, and they're accustomed to a way that how decisions are made, are going to have to adapt to that. It'll be a major change management activity. Change management takes time. I think we're going to have to be patient to see this actually mature. I would suggest there should be some thought to rolling it out in a bit of an incremental approach and not disrupting some things that are already well in train. There's probably not much advantage to perturbing those things. So what it's going to look like ultimately will be a journey to get there, and it'll be interesting to see how it'll actually be implemented and over what period of time. There'll be a capacity issue too, right? If this works, and let's hope it does, things are more timely, more predictable, CAF readiness is being positively influenced or impacted. It will take time, and it'll take capacity to absorb the additional work that then ought to be achievable if these efficiencies actually exist. Now, you could say the project teams will get smaller, and that's possible, but I don't know that anything that we're talking about right now will actually have much of an impact on the implementation phase. For instance, post-contract award until final delivery. How much of this will actually impact that? Probably, maybe it'll be a shorter period of time. I don't know. And right now, the implementation phase on major capital projects averages about 50% of the total duration of the implementation. So capacity in government and then capacity and productivity in industry, it's all going to play into the ultimate measure of success of whatever changes DPA actually implements.
Well, thanks, Troy. I have one last question for you, and I'm hoping you can reflect on your own experience in government and D&D. Given your roles as Assistant Deputy Minister for Materiel and as National Armaments Director, among several others, I'm wondering if you can reflect on, from your experience, what you think might be some key structural or process improvements that could be made to enhance efficiency and accountability when it comes to major procurement projects. Or if you want to disagree with the framing of that, feel free to as well.
I think it's going to come down to the question of how much accountability is assigned to one individual so that they can drive through decision-making, overcome or move past disagreements. There is no perfect solution. There needs to be a solution that will achieve the outcomes that are desired, and we move on. I think the other thing that will be important is ensuring that we're measuring all of this through an appropriate definition of value. Right now, the equation is capability and economic outcome for money. That's the value measure. There's probably more at play today, and I think if we take a less focused approach, right now the procurement process is focused on fair, open, and transparent. Well, in the current environment, with what we see going on around us with the current systems and the changes that we're observing, I would argue that a more strategic, fair, and transparent, where open is a choice, is going to be really important. And we're going to leverage these procurements to achieve other outcomes that you can't put a dollar sign on. How much are we contributing to our allies? How much influence through our decision-making are we going to be able to have in the future with our allies? How does that play into Canada's national interest? Those are things that don't currently get measured in a competitive process that focuses on capability, which is important and always will be, and economic outcomes, important. But I think we need to take a more strategic view and understand how that plays out at the big table at NATO, or bilaterally, or regionally with the allies we work with.
So as you all well know, on April 14th, the Liberal Party announced that if it was reelected, that the government would establish a defense procurement agency. It's not the first time that this commitment has come up. It was mentioned, I believe, in 2019 on the election platform, and that contained a similar promise that was never implemented. So when it comes to a defense procurement agency, what do you think about such an initiative, and what problems is it meant to correct or address that current structures cannot?
When setting up a defense procurement agency, I think a lot will depend on the details in order to know what problem it is hoping to address and whether or not it will be able to address it. Just to give an example, one of the key issues that comes up time and again when talking about problems with Canadian defense procurement is that there are too many departments involved, too many ministers, and a central agency, the Treasury Board, that all have to be dealt with, placated, and who all have different incentives as part of the process. So if the Defense Procurement Agency manages to give responsibility for various, if not all aspects of defense procurement to a single minister, advised by a single deputy head, I think it would achieve one key reform objective, namely to consolidate and simplify points of accountability. Namely, can we make it such that there is a single minister and a single agency accountable and responsible for defense procurement in Canada? Now, that may lead to a lot of growing pains because you may need to transfer some of the functions that currently exist within PSPC to this agency. I said could be aspects of that could be transferred to this agency. And the key thing for me, and the one to really watch, is whether or not the minister for this agency, whichever that minister happens to be, is that minister going to be given the authority of the Treasury Board to contract and to spend? And if not, then I anticipate that the reform will be somewhat half-baked.
I'm wondering if you can get into whether or not such an agency might be able to balance operational requirements from the military with oversight from civilian leadership, how it would operate.
So I think that is a very good question. To what extent will the agency be separate from the CAF, and to what extent the CAF will retain its ability to set requirements? Now, in my view, the agency should still work with the CAF, and the basic structure of requirements setting should still belong with the military and with the VCDS group in particular. So that would see the agency really taking the requirements that the CAF come up with and then acquiring those capabilities in a streamlined fashion. I think it would be more risky to have the agency either have its own requirements setting process independent of the military. I don't think that's feasible, and I don't think that makes a lot of sense, and I don't think there's the expertise in town for that to work in that way. That said, there have been models tried like that in the past. You may have additional challenge functions to requirements within the agency towards the military's requirements, but we already have quite a few challenge functions within the system when it comes to military requirements that could be leveraged, such as the independent review panel on defense acquisition. So to my mind, you would still have the oversight mechanism and the civilian control there, but the requirements setting should still belong with the military to make sure that we have a cohesive and a logical force structure coming out of this.
I'm wondering if we can build a little bit more on what we were just discussing. Can you touch on what specific authorities or decision-making powers the agency might need to be granted to avoid perhaps, just becoming maybe a rebranded layer of bureaucracy instead of delivering real improvements with speed and accountability?
What I would caution against is the idea that the agency should simply be a renamed Assistant Deputy Minister for Ministerial within DD. If that's the idea, then why are we bothering? That really wouldn't make a lot of sense to me. To my mind, the agency should bring together and consolidate the authorities of PSPC within the agency for procurement. It should house what currently is the ADM material group as within the agency. And in order to ensure that the defense industrial strategy moves forward and is done in such a way that military requirements and the industrial piece speak to each other more seamlessly, it should integrate those aspects of ISA that are dealing with the defense industrial base. Now, that would be in keeping with the French model. It would be in keeping as well with the Australian approach, and it would be in keeping with the new National Armaments Director that the United Kingdom is setting up. So there is a movement of travel here across our allies of bringing these things together. The key thing for me, though, really, again, is what is the relationship between this agency and the Treasury Board? If the agency still has to go through the board, and we have the caution that exists within TBS and within the board itself and the risk aversion, then we may not reach the full promise that a more consolidated approach could bring. And I really do worry that if the agency is still bumping up against either the Treasury Board schedule or the concerns and risk aversion of the Secretariat, then it may not really be a solution.
Do you think if successfully implemented, could procurement agency potentially or hypothetically insulate decisions from partisan politics, or would it simply relocate political pressures to a new institution?
I would not view the creation of an agency as a means of getting bipartisan or cross-party support for defense procurement. That has to be done in other ways. The way that one would do that would be to either empower the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defense to better review procurements and to be more involved in that decision-making process by providing real oversight of the decisions the agency is making. And one could do that by having members of that committee cleared to review procurement projects and track them more closely. If the argument is that NDDN, so the Standing Committee of National Defense of the Commons, is too busy to do that, perhaps we could stand up a joint committee of the Senate and the House of Commons that would be solely tasked with defense procurement, cleared to review defense procurement, and here again try and achieve buy-in from all the political parties as these projects make their way through. For that to work, though, we would also need a far greater transparency on the part of the government when it comes to what the agency is doing, how procurements are being made, what risks are being taken. Because if you are going to ask other parties to see what you're doing and to accept that you're assuming a greater degree of risk for the national interest, you have to be clear and transparent about it. If you're not clear and transparent, then you're just courting controversy.
So you have touched on this a little bit, but do you think you can comment on how such an agency could be phased in while causing, I suppose, minimal disruption?
I think there's a real trade-off here when it comes to the creation of the agency. If you want to keep it simple and easy, you simply rename current elements of the government as being part of the agency. You really just give it a new color of paint. So you just get involved in nomenclature, right? So you take parts of different departments and you say they're nominally part of the agency, or you do some transfer of functions from some departments to others and just call it the Defense Procurement Agency, but fundamentally you haven't changed much. But I think that would be a mistake. The reality is if we simply try and tinker with the existing procurement rules, regulations, and structures, we will not get very far. I would say that if the clearest evidence of whether or not the government is serious about this and serious about making a real change is if there's a legislative change to the Defense Production Act that would empower this agency in such a way and a minister in such a way to truly streamline procurement and speed things up. Because simply working within the existing regulations is not going to be sufficient.
Well, thank you, Philippe. I'm wondering if before we close up the interview, would you be able to maybe summarize or condense once again your maybe initial feelings or thoughts about the developments of a procurement agency, and then maybe you could touch on any final thoughts you have or issues that are also integral to this discussion that maybe we missed in our short time together.
Simply put, to summarize, the Defense Procurement Agency may be one step to help improve the procurement process, but a lot will depend on the details. If it's simply renaming parts of the existing system and hoping that with a new name and maybe a new executive at the top that things will be better. I don't think that we're necessarily going to achieve the outcome that we're aiming for, and it could simply add more process and introduce change at a time when we actually need to speed things up. So it may slow things down rather than make it faster. If, on the other hand, the government is really serious about this and introduces major legislative change that empowers this agency and a minister to truly make decisions in the national interest, both on the industrial side and on the capability side, then I think it might be a real opportunity to speed things up and deliver capability and economic growth for Canadians.
Chuck, thanks so much again for joining me and for always being open to come on the podcast.
Much appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So as you'll well know, on April 14th, the Liberal Party announced that if they would be elected, they'd establish a defense procurement agency. This, however, is not necessarily a new commitment. Back in 2019, the election platform contained a similar promise that was never implemented. Chuck, I'm wondering if you can talk about what a defense procurement agency would be exactly, and what specific problems it would be meant to solve in the current system.
Well, I guess maybe I could frame it slightly differently a little bit. But what I understand of the Defense Procurement Agency concept, as it has been articulated by a few people, is that that's what it does. It does defense procurement. So it would, in principle, bring together the functions that are currently resident in Public Services and Procurement Canada and in D&D, and presumably in Industry, Science, and Economic Development Canada, into a single organization that buys stuff for defense, buys services also for defense. The problem I have with it is that it treats defense procurement as a standalone activity, and it's not. Defense procurement is an important activity, but it's a contributor to the management of defense capabilities. So acquire them, sustain them, use them, dispose of them at the end of their life cycle, and also the conduct of operations. So it's kind of in computer terms, computer language terms, a do loop that's continuously running throughout the life of defense capabilities. And my concern is that we're by creating an organization that just does that and giving it a separate existence, that we're treating one fragmented business model, or replacing one fragmented business model with another fragmented business model that doesn't really get to the fundamental requirements of supporting defense capabilities throughout their life cycle. So my take is that what we need is not a defense procurement agency, but a defense capability acquisition and support agency, which is the model that is much more widely used. The UK now has it, and the Defense Equipment and Support Organization, Australia's Capability Acquisition and Support Group, the NATO Defense Defense Procurement and Support Agency. Many European countries also similarly construct their MODs around this end-to-end view of capability management. And I believe that that's where Canada also needs to go.
Well, thanks for that insider, Chuck. I've been speaking with a few other experts for this podcast. And what's come up in discussions is that there seems to be a bit of a narrative about how a quote unquote single point of accountability might improve the system. But what's come up in these discussions is that, as opposed to necessarily one point of accountability, what's really needed is the assignment of a single point of authority over stakeholders who have input to decision making. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this, or if you'd like to build on or address that notion.
Yeah, so I get where that thought is coming from. I don't agree with it. I do think that there needs to be a single belly button to push. There needs to be a single business framework within which there's a hierarchy within which decisions are made. If there is a capacity within the organization to do effective performance management end to end throughout it, and you, in my view, having work spread out around multiple organizations, particularly in a political construct like a Westminster democracy, where cabinet ministers are essentially co-equal in authority and subordinate only to the prime minister, that all you do in that model is you give some single minister the accountability for the outcomes, but no authority, no real authority, mechanical, tools of persuasion and direction and demanding performance. That means that basically the prime minister is still the only person in charge. So I don't see that more consensual, collaborative model being made to work in any meaningful way.
If a procurement agency is potentially going to bring with it even more challenges, how can we ensure that an agency like this or the current arrangement empowers ministers to make maybe bolder or more strategic procurement decisions that are in the national interest and that could be institutionalized without creating or increasing partisan risk?
Yeah, so I actually don't think that we would, even with a single agency or even with a single end-to-end defense capability acquisition and support agency, we would still have some level of collective ministerial consideration of issues. So, for example, most decisions of any size have to go to Treasury Board, and I fundamentally doubt that the government would allow a single minister to unilaterally make those kinds of big decisions on behalf of the rest of cabinet. I think there will always be some sort of a cabinet structure around that. The issue for me is more along the lines, if we do have a single minister who's taking these big decisions to their Treasury Board colleagues, then I think there is a legitimate case to be made for having the Treasury Board Secretariat seriously up its game in terms of its capacity to understand and analyze and objectively assess those proposals that are coming forward, because defense requirements are quite different in many cases from sort of the routine government business. And the way Treasury Board Secretariat has traditionally operated, the analysts don't necessarily have any expertise on defense issues. They're quite often quite junior people, ambitious people, very clever people, but in my experience dealing with issues before Treasury Board, it's a very haphazard kind of process, and you're constantly answering the same questions time after time after time, because either they don't understand or there's some new player who's come to the table and wants to go back to square one. So I think that there is some work that could be done and needs to be done within Treasury Board Secretariat, because I think it is simply not credible in my view that the government would contemplate bypassing that particular authority.
Chuck, you recently wrote a new book,
I've lost you, Josh. Hope you're going to come back. I'm not hearing you.
Chuck, sorry, I just dropped the call. I think we should still be recording. Do you mind if I just repeat that first part of the question, Chuck?
Not at all. Go ahead.
Okay. Chuck, you recently wrote a new book, True North Strong, Canadians' Guide to National Defense. I'm wondering if you might be able to reflect on both your experience and your recent book, and maybe you can offer us your own diagnosis of what needs to change in order for procurement to be streamlined. So, quite a tall order, but I think we're looking forward to hearing what you think.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and interestingly, the adoption of any new procurement business model in the government wouldn't necessarily address all the challenges that we face. The Ukraine war is showing some serious weaknesses in the traditional phased, very deliberate planned procurements where you specify everything to death and then you go around and call for bids to build to print or to develop and produce a new capability or new system. We need to have much more agility and flexibility. I know in the U.S., actually started a number of years ago by Ashton Carter, who was the Secretary of Defense for Obama, began trying to improve the way the U.S. military contracts with and through Silicon Valley in a completely different business construct that works very, very differently, where contracts are put in place with a handshake first. The paperwork follows later, and there's an evolutionary development of the relationship. You might start with a proof of concept development to solve a problem, and then progressively expand that. And we're seeing that in the Ukraine war, and the Ukrainians have been outstanding in leveraging new technologies, various kinds of new technologies, and just try something, see if it works, and then build on that. And I think the Americans have had some considerable success. There's an interesting book or two I've read on that lately. And we need to be able to do that here in Canada. We need to be able to work with creative, intelligent entrepreneurs and engineers. And not every project is going to be successful, but we need to be able to start, plant the seed, water the plant, watch it grow, and keep investing in that industrial solution up until the point where we find out, well, it's not really going to work. It's not really going to solve the problem. In which case, you go on to the next one. But if it does grow into that big tree that you really want, then you're not stopping the process and then going out with a traditional procurement, competitive procurement cycle with bringing in other potential players and then losing basically the value of all the investment that you've done from that original point. So you still need the big honking project processes for a lot of stuff, most stuff indeed, probably. But we need to come up with ways to be much more flexible, agile, and we need a lot more procurement strategies in the toolbox, and that's where I think that a single entity can have a lot more agility in pursuing those things, whereas these multi-headed, multi-department solutions, you got to go through the same debates and arguments with each with 3 or 4 departments, and you'll never get there from here.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert series is released every Tuesday and Thursday, but we'll be taking a bit of a break this summer and releasing one podcast per week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.